He never pulled the trigger, yet every bullet in the Mafia's golden age had his fingerprints on it. Charles Lucky Luciano wasn't the loudest, the flashiest, or the most feared killer on the streets, but he was the man who rewrote the rules of organized crime. From a poor Sicilian immigrant hustling on the corners of New York's Lower East Side, Luciano rose to become something the underworld had never seen before, a CEO of crime. He understood that power wasn't about street fights or body counts. It was about organization, networks, and vision. While men like Al Capone built empires that eventually collapsed under their own chaos, Luciano built something stronger, something enduring. He took the old-world feuds of Italian gangs and transformed them into a corporate structure, the Commission, that still echoes through the Mafia today. This is the story of how Lucky Luciano turned crime into a business, how he outsmarted rivals and allies alike, and how a man who spent years behind bars and in exile still managed to shape the very foundations of modern organized crime in America. Charles. Lucky Luciano's story begins in 1897, in the small Sicilian town of La Carafridi, where the dusty streets and narrow alleys were filled not with dreams of fortune, but with hunger and struggle. He was born Salvatore Lucania, the son of Antonio and Rosalia, an ordinary family of peasants who lived as so many others in Sicily did at the time, poor, working the land and watching the world move forward without them. For the Lucania family, America was the whispered promise of a better life, the golden escape across the Atlantic. In 1906, when Charles was just 9 years old, that dream carried them onto a crowded steamship bound for New York City. What they found on arrival wasn't the America of myth and prosperity, but the cramped slums of the Lower East Side, where immigrant families piled into tenements stacked like cages. Poverty here was as suffocating as it had been in Sicily, only louder, dirtier, and more dangerous. Charles, who would come to be known as Charlie in the streets, was thrust into this world of survival, where kids didn't learn math or literature first. They learned how to fight, how to bluff, and how to take what wasn't given. He was small for his age, sharp-eyed and quick-tongued, and in the alleys of 5 Points that meant everything. School was never his passion. He found little use for lessons that didn't translate into survival or money. By the time he was a teenager, he was skipping more classes than he attended. Instead, he was drawn to the action of the streets, pickpocketing, running errands for older boys, and learning how to intimidate. These became his real lessons. The Lower East Side was a crucible of cultures and gangs, Italians, Jews, Irish, and others packed into the same overcrowded blocks. For most, these rivalries bred violence and hostility, but Charlie saw something different. He saw possibility. Even as a boy, he had an instinct for leadership. When other kids bullied the smaller ones for pennies, Charlie spotted a business opportunity. At just 10 years old, he offered protection to his classmates for a fee. Pay him a nickel a week, and he'd make sure no one bothered you. If anyone tried, they'd have to answer to him. It was a miniature version of the rackets he'd one day oversee on a national scale. But the seeds were already there. For young Luciano, this wasn't just about toughness. It was about controlling risk, guaranteeing order in chaos, and collecting revenue without lifting a finger. What separated him from the other rough kids of the neighborhood wasn't that he fought harder. It was that he fought smarter. He understood early that violence had its place, but brains could buy more power than fists ever could. It was during these years that he encountered another boy who would become his lifelong ally, Meyer Lansky. Lansky, the son of Jewish immigrants, was sharp, calculating and ruthless in his own quiet way. The two boys from different backgrounds recognized something in each other: ambition, intelligence, and a willingness to bend rules. While many Italians stuck to their own, Charlie broke the unspoken law of ethnic loyalty and formed bonds across cultures. This, more than anything else, would set him apart in the years to come. The Lower East Side, with its melting pot of hustlers and gangsters, became Luciano's training ground. Petty thefts turned into bigger schemes. He became skilled at gambling, especially dice games, and learned to manipulate the odds in his favor. By his mid-teens, he wasn't just a kid on the corner anymore. He was running with small-time gangs, making connections with older, more established figures in the Italian underworld. The 5 Points gang, notorious for its brutality and dominance over the neighborhood, loomed large in his formative years. While he wasn't yet at the core of it, he admired its structure, its command over territory, and the respect it demanded. His nickname Lucky came later, but the legend around it began in these years. Some said it was because of his uncanny ability to escape the police, slipping away from arrests time and again. Others whispered it came from surviving beatings and attacks that would have killed another man. A darker version claims he earned it after surviving a near-fatal knife attack in his 20s. But the aura of luck was already surrounding him. In truth, Luciano's luck was not magic, but calculation. He knew when to take risks, when to cut deals, and when to disappear into the shadows. He gave the impression of being lucky, but more often than not, he had simply prepared better than anyone else. By his late teens, Luciano had dropped out of school entirely and committed himself to the streets full-time. He was dealing heroin and morphine in small quantities, dabbling in drugs at a time when Prohibition was still on the horizon. He discovered early that the real money was in vices, the things people craved but couldn't get legally. This understanding would later explode into his empire when alcohol was banned. For now, though, it was about building a reputation. Luciano earned respect not only because he could fight, but because he kept his word. In the underworld, trust was currency, and Charlie understood that a man whose promises were reliable could go further than one who relied only on intimidation. Another lesson of his youth came in the form of brutality. In the streets, betrayal was always around the corner, and young Charlie learned to keep his friends close, but his enemies closer. Stories circulated of him taking beatings, knife wounds, and once being kidnapped and tortured by rival gangsters, left for dead. Each time he came back harder, smarter, and more careful. His survival became part of his myth, reinforcing the nickname Lucky. The more the stories spread, the more his reputation grew. By the time he was 20, Luciano wasn't just another street thug. He was a rising figure who people began to notice. He dressed better than the average gangster, preferring sharp suits even when his pockets were thin. He cultivated an image, understanding that perception mattered as much as reality. A man who looked powerful often was powerful, because others treated him that way. The friendships he forged during this era became the backbone of his later empire. Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, Jewish gangsters from the same rough neighborhoods, would eventually join him in reshaping the American underworld. Together, they experimented with small rackets, gambling houses, and bootlegging operations before Prohibition made such ventures unimaginably profitable. Luciano's ability to think beyond tribal lines, to ally with non-Italians in a world where such collaborations were rare, was the first glimpse of the visionary he would become. In those early years, Charlie Lucania, the poor immigrant boy from Sicily, had already begun to transform. He was no longer simply surviving. He was studying, adapting, planning. Every petty crime, every back-alley deal, every nickel he collected from a scared schoolboy was a piece of education. He was writing the blueprint for a new kind of criminal leadership, one that looked less like a gang brawler and more like a corporate strategist. By the end of his youth, Luciano had become more than a product of the Lower East Side. He had become a master of it, and the city was starting to whisper his name. What makes Luciano's early life so significant isn't just the story of rags to riches, but the philosophy that grew out of it. While others saw enemies in rival gangs, Luciano saw potential partners. Where others saw chaos in the slums, he saw opportunity. Where others relied on intimidation, he understood that a promise kept could be more powerful than a threat. These were not just survival tactics. They were the foundations of a criminal empire. As the decade turned and Prohibition loomed on the horizon, New York was about to explode into a gold rush of illegal profits. Lucky Luciano, armed with the instincts he had honed since childhood, was perfectly positioned. The boy from Sicily was now a man with ambition, and soon he would prove that his vision went far beyond the corners of the Lower East Side. He wasn't just going to play the game, he was going to change it forever. The Prohibition years would change America forever, and for Charles Lucky Luciano, they would become the stage on which he transformed from an ambitious street hustler into one of the most powerful figures the underworld had ever seen. When the Volstead Act went into effect in 1920, banning the production and sale of alcohol, it turned millions of ordinary citizens into criminals overnight. It also created a multi-billion-dollar black market, and for the men who had cut their teeth in the alleys of New York, it was an invitation to a fortune. Luciano understood almost immediately that this was an opportunity unlike any other. He had already been dabbling in rackets and gambling, but booze was different. Everyone wanted it, rich and poor, immigrants and elites, politicians and policemen. And when everyone wants something, the man who controls supply becomes indispensable. To seize this moment, Luciano knew he needed allies, connections and protection, and that meant finding his place within the Italian Mafia, which was then a fractured, bloody collection of clans constantly fighting for control. At the time, two powerful Sicilian bosses dominated New York: Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano. Their rivalry was a constant source of bloodshed, and for a young man like Luciano, choosing sides could be a death sentence. Still, he recognized that aligning with a strong patron was the key to legitimacy and power. Luciano threw his lot in with Joe Masseria, a brutal but influential don who demanded loyalty and obedience. To Masseria, Luciano was useful, a tough young man who could earn, who had vision, and who wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty when necessary. But Luciano was never content to be just another soldier in Masseria's army. Unlike many of the old Sicilian bosses who clung to traditions and codes from the old world, he was modern in his outlook. He didn't care much for oaths or the endless cycles of vendettas. What mattered to him was money and influence. This mindset made him stand out in an underworld still stuck in feudal ways. Luciano didn't hesitate to bend rules that others considered sacred, and though it earned him suspicion from some of the old guard, it also made him an asset in the rapidly changing landscape of Prohibition-era New York. His ability to build trust came from a balance of ruthlessness and strategy. If a rival needed to be eliminated, Luciano didn't flinch. Violence was part of the business, but he never killed for sport or ego. Every move was calculated. If he threatened someone, he followed through, and if he promised protection, he delivered. People quickly learned that dealing with Luciano meant certainty. In a world where betrayal was common and trust was a fragile commodity, that reliability made him indispensable. It was also during this time that Luciano deepened his alliances with non-Italian gangsters, particularly Jewish figures like Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. Lansky was a quiet, sharp-minded strategist, while Siegel was brash and fearless, willing to pull the trigger without hesitation. Together with Luciano, they formed an unlikely trio. While many Italian bosses scoffed at the idea of working with Jews, Luciano saw it differently. To him, money didn't care about ethnicity. Business was business. This philosophy led to an empire that stretched far beyond the traditional boundaries of the Italian Mafia. Luciano and Lansky pooled resources, ran bootlegging operations, and established distribution networks that dwarfed those of their competitors. They bribed police, bought off politicians, and built a system where the law was more an inconvenience than an obstacle. Their liquor came in from Canada, often through elaborate smuggling routes that used trucks, ships, and even planes. Once it hit the streets of New York, it flowed into speakeasies and nightclubs where the rich and powerful drank without shame. The money was staggering. In just a few years, Luciano and his associates were earning sums unimaginable to ordinary citizens. Tens of millions of dollars flowed through their hands, and with it came influence. Luciano became known not just as an earner, but as a man who could organize, plan and scale operations like a businessman. His friends and enemies alike began to notice that he was different. He wasn't a brute who relied only on muscle. He was a strategist who could see the bigger picture. One of the turning points in his rise came from his ability to navigate between Masseria's demands and his own ambitions. While serving Joe the boss, Luciano maintained his independence, quietly building his own networks and alliances that operated outside of Masseria's direct control. He was loyal when it suited him, but he was never chained by blind allegiance. This careful balancing act allowed him to gain the protection of a powerful patron, while also preparing for the day when he might stand on his own. During Prohibition, Luciano also honed his skills at cultivating relationships with politicians and law enforcement. He understood that money could open doors faster than bullets. Judges, cops, and city officials were all on the take, and Luciano made sure his envelopes were the fattest. This didn't just buy him protection from raids or arrests. It also bought him intelligence. He often knew about police operations before they happened, giving him time to move shipments or relocate operations. His luck in avoiding serious prison time during these years was no coincidence. It was the result of calculated bribery and influence. Meanwhile, his partnerships with Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel began to bear even greater fruit. They pioneered the idea of syndicate-style operations, where profits were shared, risks were distributed, and rivalries were minimized in favor of collective gain. This was in stark contrast to the old way, where bosses guarded territory jealously, and wars broke out over minor disputes. Luciano was essentially testing, on a small scale, the model he would later implement citywide through the Commission. By the mid-1920s, Luciano was no longer just a promising young gangster. He was a major player. His bootlegging empire stretched across boroughs. His influence reached into City Hall, and his alliances gave him protection few could match. Still, he was careful not to overstep. He knew that to challenge men like Masseria or Maranzano directly would be suicide. Instead, he positioned himself as indispensable, quietly gaining power while letting others fight bloody wars that drained their resources. It was during this period that Luciano also began cultivating his image. He dressed impeccably, favoring tailored suits and silk ties, and carried himself with the confidence of a man who knew he was destined for more. Unlike the flashy gangsters who flaunted their wealth recklessly, Luciano projected an aura of professionalism. He looked less like a street thug and more like a businessman, which made him more palatable to the elites he needed as allies. Nightclubs, hotels, and restaurants became his stage, where he mingled with celebrities, politicians, and businessmen, all while pulling strings behind the scenes. The combination of brutality, intelligence, and vision made him both respected and feared. Rivals who underestimated him often paid the price. Associates who proved loyal were rewarded handsomely. Luciano understood human nature better than most. He knew that fear could command obedience, but respect could build loyalty, and money could buy both. As Prohibition roared on, the city was awash in illegal liquor, and the profits seemed endless. But the underworld was also unstable. The rivalry between Masseria and Maranzano simmered, threatening to erupt into open war. For Luciano, this presented both a danger and an opportunity. He had spent the decade positioning himself, building alliances not just within the Italian Mafia, but across ethnic lines, and strengthening his own independent power base. When the Castellamarese War eventually broke out, Luciano would be ready, not as a foot soldier, but as a kingmaker. By the end of the Prohibition era, Charles Lucky Luciano had risen from a street kid running protection rackets in the Lower East Side to a millionaire gangster with networks that stretched across the country. His partnerships with men like Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, his strategic positioning under Masseria, and his ability to think like a businessman had set him apart from nearly every other mobster of his time. He wasn't yet the undisputed boss, but everyone in New York's underworld could feel it coming. Luciano had proven that he could rise through the ranks not just by force, but by vision. He had turned bootlegging into an empire, built bridges where others burned them, and quietly positioned himself at the center of power. The old Mafia bosses still held their thrones, but behind them, pulling strings and calculating his next move, was a young man with the instincts of a king. The streets whispered his name with both respect and fear. Lucky Luciano had arrived, and the world of organized crime would never be the same. By the end of the 1920s, New York's underworld was a powder keg waiting to explode. The riches of Prohibition had made gangsters wealthier than kings, but it had also sharpened rivalries. Everyone wanted a bigger slice of the pie, and among the Italian Mafia, Old World grudges collided with New World opportunity. At the centre of this chaos stood two titans, Giuseppe, Joe the Boss, Masseria, the entrenched Don of Manhattan, and Salvatore Maranzano, the ambitious Sicilian challenger from Castellammare del Golfo. Their conflict would ignite a bloody war that consumed the city, and it would give Charles Lucky Luciano the stage to execute the most audacious power play in Mafia history. For years, Joe Masseria had ruled with an iron fist, demanding loyalty, tribute, and obedience from those under his wing. He was feared, but he was also old-fashioned, a man of brute force rather than strategy. Luciano had attached himself to Masseria, building his career under his protection, but he never confused loyalty with blind servitude. He could see that Masseria's style of leadership was outdated, too rigid for the modern criminal empire Luciano envisioned. Salvatore Maranzano, however, represented something equally dangerous. A Sicilian traditionalist, Maranzano had come to New York determined to impose his will, drawing on soldiers from his hometown of Castellammare and using them to challenge Masseria's dominance. The rivalry between the two men escalated quickly into open violence. Murders, ambushes, and bombings turned the streets of New York into battlegrounds. The Castellammare's War, as it came to be known, dragged on for years, leaving bodies in its wake and creating chaos across the underworld. For the average mob soldier, survival meant choosing a side and sticking with it. For Luciano, survival meant something different. He chose both. Luciano perfected what would later be called the betrayer strategy. Publicly, he remained loyal to Masseria, serving as one of his top lieutenants and assuring him of his allegiance. Privately, however, he opened channels of communication with Maranzano, calculating that whichever side emerged victorious, he would be indispensable. It was a dangerous game. One wrong move could mean death from either camp. But it was also the kind of high-stakes gamble that defined Luciano's genius. He wasn't fighting for one boss or the other. He was fighting for the future he intended to control. The war dragged on, and with every passing year, Luciano's dissatisfaction with Masseria grew. Joe the Boss was a creature of habit, stubborn and blind to the possibilities of cooperation. He refused to work with non-Italians, clung to outdated methods, and saw violence as the only solution to problems. Luciano, with his alliances to Jewish partners like Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, knew that the old ways were holding the Mafia back. For organized crime to survive and thrive, it needed to evolve into something more structured, more disciplined, more profitable. And that meant getting rid of the old guard. By 1931, Luciano made his move. He secretly brokered a deal with Maranzano, agreeing to betray Masseria in exchange for a position of power in the new order Maranzano promised to build. The betrayal required precision and courage. Luciano lured Masseria to a Coney Island restaurant on April 15, 1931, under the guise of a friendly lunch. As the story goes, the two men played cards while Luciano excused himself to use the restroom. In his absence, gunmen stormed the room, men Luciano himself had arranged. Joe Masseria was gunned down at the table, his body riddled with bullets and the playing cards scattered across the floor. The assassination sent shockwaves through the underworld. Joe the Boss, the once untouchable Don, was dead. For most, this meant Maranzano now stood unchallenged as the boss of all bosses. For Luciano, it was merely the first act in a larger drama. True to his word, Maranzano rewarded Luciano, giving him a prominent role in the reorganized Mafia. He declared himself Capo di tutti capi, the boss of all bosses, insisting that every other family pay tribute to him. He introduced Roman-inspired structures, calling his captains centurions, and casting himself as an emperor. On the surface, it looked like the dawn of a new era. In reality, it was simply another version of the same old rule by fear and domination. And Luciano had no intention of living under another autocrat. At first, Luciano played along, biding his time. But he quickly realized that Maranzano was no improvement over Masseria. If anything, he was worse. Paranoid and power-hungry, Maranzano began plotting against Luciano, convinced the younger man's ambition made him dangerous. He hired killers to eliminate Luciano and his closest allies, hoping to consolidate power before they could move against him. Unfortunately for Maranzano, Luciano's network of spies and informants was too strong. He learned of the plot before it could be carried out. Once again, Luciano struck first. In September 1931, less than 5 months after Masseria's murder, Luciano set his sights on Maranzano. He enlisted Jewish hitmen, men not recognizable to Maranzano's guards, ensuring they could get close without suspicion. Posing as tax officials, the killers entered Maranzano's Manhattan office under the pretense of conducting an audit. Once inside, they drew their weapons and stabbed and shot Maranzano to death. Just like that, the so-called boss of all bosses was eliminated, and Luciano had removed the last obstacle to his vision. The Castellamarese War, which had claimed dozens of lives and destabilized the Mafia for years, was finally over. But it didn't end with one man victorious in the old sense. It ended with Luciano reshaping the very structure of the underworld. Instead of allowing another autocrat to rise, he abolished the title of Capo di tutti capi altogether. In its place, he created the Commission, a board of directors composed of the major Mafia bosses, designed to prevent wars and manage disputes collectively. It was a revolutionary step that transformed organized crime from a feudal collection of rival clans into a modern syndicate. In orchestrating the assassinations of both Masseria and Maranzano, Luciano had not only secured his own power, but had also redefined leadership in the Mafia. He proved that brains and strategy could triumph over brute force and tradition. He had outmaneuvered two of the most powerful dons in America, without firing a shot himself, cementing his reputation as a master manipulator and visionary. The betrayals shocked many, but to those who knew Luciano, they were perfectly in character. For him, loyalty was always conditional. He was loyal to progress, to the future of organized crime as he saw it, not to men who stood in the way of that future. To Luciano, eliminating Masseria and Maranzano wasn't treachery, it was business. The aftermath of the war elevated Luciano to a status no young gangster had ever achieved. He was now the power broker of the American Mafia, the architect of its modern structure, and the undisputed visionary of the underworld. His name carried weight not just in New York, but in Chicago, Cleveland, Detroit, and beyond. He had played both sides of a brutal conflict, betrayed his bosses, and yet emerged as the one man everyone needed. The Castellamarese War was more than a gangland feud. It was the crucible in which Lucky Luciano forged his legacy. He had survived a storm of violence, outwitted the most dangerous men of his era, and transformed organized crime into something resembling a corporation. For the first time, the Mafia wasn't just a collection of gangs. It was an institution. And at its center, guiding its evolution, was a man who had grown up on the dirty streets of the Lower East Side, now poised to become the CEO of the American underworld. The murder of Salvatore Maranzano in September 1931 left a void at the heart of the American underworld. For years, gangsters had fought and bled for the title of Capo di tutti capi, the boss of all bosses, but Luciano had no intention of claiming it. To him, that very idea was poison, a relic of Sicilian feudalism that created endless cycles of paranoia, betrayal, and war. He had watched two powerful dons fall to bullets and blades, and he knew the lesson. A single man ruling unchecked was a single man destined to be overthrown. If organized crime was to thrive in America, it needed a structure that was not medieval but modern. It needed something that looked less like a monarchy and more like a corporation. Luciano was only in his mid-30s, but he had a clarity of vision most older bosses lacked. Instead of installing himself as a dictator, he proposed something radical. A governing body where power would be shared among the most influential families. A board of directors for crime. Each boss would have a seat, each would have a voice, and disputes could be settled through consensus rather than bullets. He called it the Commission. It was the single most important structural change in the history of the Mafia, and it would endure for decades. The Commission was born out of necessity as much as vision. The Castellamarese War had left scars. Too many dead soldiers, too many businesses disrupted, too much attention from police and newspapers. Luciano knew another war of that scale would attract heat that could cripple their empire. To keep the peace, he needed rules. He needed a forum where rival bosses could negotiate without losing face. And most importantly, he needed to bind the Mafia together, not by fear, but by profit. At its core, the Commission was modelled on American corporate culture. Luciano had absorbed the lessons of capitalism by watching Wall Street and Fifth Avenue as much as he had by studying Sicilian traditions. He admired how big companies divided markets, cut deals, and resolved disputes through contracts instead of violence. Why couldn't the Mafia do the same? After all, they were running a business. Bootlegging, gambling, extortion, labor racketeering. Violence was bad for business. Stability was good for business. And so, the Mafia's future would be built not on vendettas, but on revenue streams. The founding members of the Commission reflected Luciano's pragmatism. He invited the bosses of the most powerful Italian families in New York, men like Vincent Mangano, Joe Profaci, and Tommy Galliano, to sit at the table. He extended it to Chicago, giving Al Capone's outfit representation through Capone's successor, Frank Nitti. Other major cities like Buffalo and Cleveland gained recognition. Each family would control its own territory, but larger decisions, alliances, disputes, and national ventures would be overseen collectively. In this way, the Commission became a boardroom where America's criminal empire was managed like a Fortune 500 company. Luciano also introduced the concept of dividing profits as a stabilizing mechanism. No longer would gangsters fight bloody wars for control of rackets. Instead, profits could be split, percentages negotiated, and disputes arbitrated. It was, in effect, a shareholders' agreement written in blood and enforced by mutual interest. If a family violated the rules, the others could unite against them. If a boss grew too ambitious, his peers could check him. The commission was not about trust, it was about balance, about creating a system where betrayal carried a price too high to risk. But perhaps the most revolutionary element of Luciano's vision was his willingness to transcend ethnic lines. While the Italian Mafia remained at the core of the commission, Luciano recognized the value of cooperation with Jewish and Irish mobsters. Men like Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel had already proven indispensable partners during Prohibition. Arnold Rothstein before them had demonstrated how gambling and narcotics could be turned into empires with the right brains behind the operation. Luciano wasn't blinded by old-world prejudices. To him, money had no ethnicity. If a man could earn, he had a place in the enterprise. This philosophy of inclusion gave organized crime a flexibility it had never known. While the Italian families kept formal control of the commission, Luciano's personal alliances with Jewish mobsters created an informal partnership that expanded the Mafia's reach far beyond its traditional base. Lansky, with his mathematical mind and calm temperament, became Luciano's consigliere in all but name, advising on investments, casinos and money laundering. Siegel, brash and fearless, opened doors in Hollywood and Las Vegas. Together, this multi-ethnic network created what journalists would later call the National Crime Syndicate, a loose but powerful confederation of gangs across America, working together under Luciano's guiding hand. The results were immediate. With Prohibition repealed in 1933, bootlegging profits collapsed, but the commission ensured the Mafia pivoted smoothly into other ventures: gambling, prostitution, narcotics, labor racketeering, and legitimate business fronts. Luciano understood diversification before the word became fashionable. He invested in nightclubs, construction companies, and shipping firms. He saw that politics was as important as pistols, and through bribery and influence, he extended the Mafia's reach into unions and city contracts. With the commission as a stabilizing force, organized crime no longer lurched from one bloody war to the next. It operated with the efficiency of a multinational corporation. To outsiders, the changes were subtle. Gangsters still drove Cadillacs, wore silk suits and ran speakeasies. Murders still happened when someone stepped out of line. But beneath the surface, the entire underworld had been restructured. For the first time, there were clear territories, defined rules, and a mechanism for resolving disputes without open warfare. The Commission's existence was a secret, but its impact was felt everywhere. Policemen and politicians scratched their heads, wondering why the violence seemed to calm down, unaware that a new governing council was quietly keeping the peace. Luciano himself became something different from the typical mob boss. He wasn't just feared, he was respected, even admired by his peers. He carried himself like a CEO, calm, pragmatic, willing to compromise if it meant long-term stability. He still had the cold heart of a gangster, willing to eliminate anyone who crossed him. But his true genius was in knowing when not to pull the trigger. His commission was built not on violence, but on the threat of violence, a deterrent that allowed business to flourish in relative order. Of course, the system wasn't perfect. Egos still clashed, betrayals still simmered, and power was never evenly distributed. But compared to the chaos of the 1920s, the 1930s under Luciano were almost peaceful. The Mafia became invisible, blending into the fabric of American life. Politicians unknowingly shook hands with commission-backed businessmen. Movie stars parted in clubs funded by syndicate money. Construction projects rose on land secured by mobbed-up unions. For many Americans, organized crime seemed to vanish. In truth, it had simply professionalized. Luciano's genius lay not just in creating the commission, but in selling it to others. He persuaded proud and violent men to give up the fantasy of absolute power in exchange for stability and wealth. He framed cooperation not as weakness, but as strength. He convinced killers and racketeers that they were businessmen, that their true power lay in acting like a corporation rather than a clan. And once the structure was in place, it became self-sustaining. Even after Luciano's eventual downfall, the commission endured, a testament to the durability of his vision. In the end, Luciano's founding of the commission marked the birth of modern organized crime in America. He had taken a fragmented, tribal network of gangs and turned it into a syndicate that mirrored the very capitalist system it exploited. He gave crime a boardroom, a constitution, and a business plan. He turned mobsters into executives and rackets into portfolios. More than any single murder or betrayal, this act cemented his legacy. For decades to come, every major mafia decision, every national alliance, every war and peace would trace its roots back to that moment in 1931, when Lucky Luciano decided that the Mafia should stop acting like a gang and start acting like General Motors. It was his most enduring act of betrayal, not against Masseria or Maranzano, but against the old ways themselves. He betrayed tradition in order to build the future. And in doing so, he ensured that the name Lucky Luciano would forever be remembered not just as a gangster, but as the architect of an empire that learned to think like America itself, in terms of profit, efficiency, and power. By the mid-1930s, Charles Lucky Luciano stood at the height of his power. The commission had transformed the Mafia into a corporate empire, and at its center sat the man who had imagined it into being. He was not merely a gangster anymore. He was an institution, a name that carried weight in every backroom, every union hall, every nightclub from New York to Los Angeles. The Mafia was no longer a loose collection of feuding families. It was an enterprise, and Luciano was its chairman. But like so many men who reached the top, he discovered that the same system that built him up had begun conspiring to drag him down. In the years after Prohibition, Luciano's reach only expanded. Gambling became one of his crown jewels. Illegal casinos in New York and New Jersey pumped steady streams of cash into his coffers, while his partners, Lansky and Siegel, were planting seeds in Nevada, transforming the desert town of Las Vegas into what would one day become the world's gambling capital. Luciano was no stranger to Hollywood either. Through Siegel, the mob's influence seeped into movie studios, nightclubs, and celebrity circles. Stars mingled with gangsters in glittering night spots, often unaware or unconcerned that their champagne was funded by racketeering. The unions were another goldmine. Luciano understood that labor was power, and power could be monetized. Dock workers, truck drivers, construction crews, All of them fell under the shadow of mob-controlled unions. Through them, Luciano controlled not only payrolls and jobs, but entire industries. If a businessman wanted goods unloaded at the port, or trucks moving on the highways, he paid tribute. Refusal meant strikes, sabotage, or worse. It was a silent, invisible tax, paid not to the government, but to the underworld. Drugs, too, became a cornerstone of Luciano's empire. While some old-timers in the Mafia considered narcotics too risky, Luciano saw opportunity. The profits were enormous, and the demand was insatiable. Heroin and cocaine found their way into American cities through networks that Luciano helped organize, stretching from Europe to Asia to South America. The risks were high, but the margins were higher, and for a man like Luciano, risk was the air he breathed. But with success came visibility, and with visibility came enemies, not just rivals in the underworld, but crusaders in law enforcement. Chief among them was Thomas E. Dewey, a young, ambitious special prosecutor with his eyes on higher office. Dewey built his reputation on taking down organized crime, and Luciano was the biggest prize of all. The challenge was that Luciano was careful, insulated, and too smart to be caught with his hands directly in the rackets. He rarely signed his name, rarely gave orders in ways that could be traced. To get him, Dewey needed something different. He needed a story the public could latch onto, a crime salacious enough to capture headlines. The opportunity came not from gambling or drugs, but from prostitution. For years, New York's brothels had operated under Mafia protection, paying regular tribute in exchange for safety and clients. Luciano didn't personally run the houses, but prosecutors claimed he oversaw the entire system, a vice empire spanning hundreds of women and pimps. In 1936, Dewey struck. He unleashed a series of raids and arrests, leaning on prostitutes to testify against Luciano. Many of the witnesses were coerced, threatened with jail, unless they pointed the finger at him. The case was shaky, but the spectacle was irresistible. Newspapers dubbed it the longest-running trial in New York's history, a moral crusade against the most powerful gangster in America. Luciano's defense argued he was being framed, that Dewey was manufacturing evidence to build his career. But in the court of public opinion, the details were damning enough. Stories of girls forced into prostitution, of an empire built on flesh, played perfectly into Dewey's narrative of crime as a disease eating at the city's soul. The trial dragged on for months, and in the end, the jury convicted Luciano on 62 counts of compulsory prostitution. The sentence was staggering: 30 to 50 years in prison. For a man who had lived his life in control, it was a devastating fall. Luciano was sent to Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, a grim fortress near the Canadian border known as Little Siberia, for its cold, isolated conditions. The press celebrated, politicians cheered, and Dewey vaulted into national prominence. But what few outside the underworld understood was that Luciano's influence did not end at the prison gates. Even from behind bars, Luciano remained a force. His network was too deep, his alliances too strong, his system too durable to collapse. Messages travelled in and out of prison through lawyers, guards, and visiting associates. Decisions still bore his stamp. The commission continued to function, and Luciano's words still carried weight in the boardrooms of organized crime. It was as if incarceration had only changed his address, not his power. And then came the war. When the United States entered World War II after Pearl Harbor, fears of sabotage and espionage ran high, especially along the docks of New York Harbor. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic, sinking American ships, and rumors spread of Axis agents operating in the city's waterfront. The Navy needed to secure the docks, but corruption and labor unrest made them vulnerable. That was when an unlikely solution presented itself: Operation Underworld. The Navy approached Meyer Lansky, who in turn approached Luciano. Despite being a convicted criminal locked away for decades, Luciano still commanded the loyalty of dockworkers and longshoremen through the mob's control of unions. The idea was simple. In exchange for cooperation with the government, Luciano could guarantee labor peace, prevent sabotage, and use his network to keep foreign spies away from the waterfront. The arrangement was unofficial, secret, and morally ambiguous, but it worked. The docks quieted, and reports of sabotage evaporated. Luciano's men even assisted with intelligence in Sicily ahead of the Allied invasion in 1943, leveraging their connections with local Mafia figures to smooth the way for American troops. For the US government, it was a devil's bargain, but one that paid dividends in wartime. The irony was profound. The same man prosecutors had painted as the embodiment of corruption and vice was now, in some sense, a partner of the United States in its greatest struggle. Luciano went from prisoner to patriot, at least on paper, and though the details of Operation Underworld remain murky, its consequences were clear. By the end of the war, Luciano had amassed goodwill in high places, enough to change the trajectory of his sentence. In 1946, Governor Thomas Dewey, the very man who had built his career by sending Luciano to prison, signed off on his commutation. The sentence was reduced, and Luciano was released on the condition of deportation to Italy. After a decade behind bars, Luciano walked free, but not into the streets of New York. He boarded a ship and left the country he had helped shape from the shadows, never to return as a resident again. His story was far from over, but the arc of power, prison, and patriotism encapsulated the contradictions that made Lucky Luciano legendary. He had risen higher than any gangster of his generation, built a structure that professionalized crime, fallen in a blaze of courtroom drama, and then bargained his way back into relevance by serving the very government that condemned him. He was at once a criminal mastermind, a prisoner, and, strangest of all, a wartime asset. Luciano's name would never be forgotten, not because he was the most violent, nor because he was the most feared, but because he was the most visionary. He understood that power was not about who pulled the trigger, but about who pulled the strings. Even locked in a cell, he kept pulling them. Even under the shadow of disgrace, he found a way to turn the machinery of America itself to his advantage. When Charles Lucky Luciano stepped off the ship that carried him back to Italy in 1946, he was a free man, but not a triumphant one. America had released him from prison only on the condition that he never return. He was 39 years old, still sharp, still ambitious, and still haunted by the knowledge that he had built an empire he could no longer walk through. The Manhattan nightclubs, the Harlem gambling dens, the longshoremen's unions. They were his in spirit, but in body, he was an exile. Italy, in the aftermath of World War II, was in ruins. Cities were shattered by bombings, economies broken, and people desperate. For Luciano, that desperation was an opportunity. In Naples, he found fertile ground for his next enterprise, the heroin trade. He had long understood that narcotics, though controversial even among mobsters, offered the highest profits. Now, with American soldiers stationed in Europe and new smuggling routes opening across the Mediterranean, Luciano quietly positioned himself at the heart of an international drug pipeline. Through connections with Sicilian and Neapolitan gangsters, Luciano facilitated shipments of morphine base from Turkey, refined into heroin in clandestine labs in Marseille, then funneled into the United States. Naples, with its chaotic ports and corrupt officials, became a critical hub. Luciano himself never touched the drugs, but everyone in law enforcement circles whispered that his fingerprints were all over the trade. Officially, he lived modestly, dining in cafes, charming visitors with stories of his American past. Unofficially, he was the invisible CEO of a transatlantic narcotics empire. But Luciano was not content to be remembered as a smuggler in exile. In 1946, he orchestrated one of the most audacious events in underworld history, the Havana Conference. Using his allies, especially Meyer Lansky, he summoned the nation's most powerful mobsters to Cuba, under the guise of a vacation. Havana was chosen not just for its glamour, but for its accessibility. Close to America, yet outside its laws, filled with casinos and nightclubs that served as perfect cover. For a few weeks, Havana became the capital of global crime. Gangsters arrived from New York, Chicago, New Orleans and beyond. Frank Costello, Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, all of them came. The meetings held in luxury hotels and casinos were less about cocktails and more about charts and ledgers. They discussed narcotics routes, gambling ventures, and the division of international profits. Luciano presided like a statesman in exile, reminding everyone that while he had been deported, his vision still guided them. Perhaps the most famous moment of the conference came when Frank Sinatra performed at a mob-backed club, serenading an audience that included the most powerful criminals in the Western Hemisphere. It was the perfect symbol of Luciano's world, crime, politics and culture blending into one glittering, dangerous night. But not everyone was pleased. Vito Genovese, always hungry for more, used the Havana stage to push himself forward, attempting to eclipse Luciano. It was a reminder that exile had weakened Lucky's grip. He could convene the mob, but he could no longer control it with the same authority he once had. Age, distance, and the relentless ambition of others had begun to erode his place in the hierarchy. Don't. Worse still, the US government noticed. Reports of the Havana gathering alarmed federal agents, and pressure mounted on Cuban authorities to expel Luciano. Within months, he was forced back to Italy, his Cuban experiment cut short. The empire he had dreamed of running from the Caribbean dissolved, leaving him once again a man of influence without a throne. In Italy, Luciano's final years were a paradox. He lived openly in Naples, often strolling the streets, chatting with locals, and sipping coffee at outdoor cafes. Tourists and journalists sought him out, eager to glimpse the legendary gangster. To them, he was half celebrity, half ghost, a man who had written the blueprint for modern organized crime, yet was trapped in exile, denied the stage of America, where he had first risen. Yet beneath the charm, surveillance reports painted a different picture. Italian and American authorities monitored him constantly, convinced he was still orchestrating heroin shipments. They tapped phones, tailed associates, and catalogued his movements. Whether Luciano was directly managing the trade or simply lending his blessing is still debated, but there is no doubt that his name carried weight in every deal made along the heroin pipeline. His health, however, began to falter. Years of hard living, smoking, drinking, stress took their toll. By the early 1960s, he looked older than his 65 years, his face heavier, his frame slower. But his mind remained sharp, and he continued to dream of cementing his legacy. In his final months, he entertained offers from filmmakers eager to turn his life story into a movie, a Hollywood gangster epic, starring himself as the consultant. For a man who had spent a lifetime in the shadows, the idea of immortality on screen was irresistible. On January 26, 1962, Luciano arrived at Naples Airport for a meeting with an American film producer. He was reportedly excited, ready to discuss the deal that might at last turn his myth into cinema. But fate intervened. As he waited outside the terminal, Luciano collapsed. His heart gave out, and he died on the spot. Even in death, the shadows followed him. Italian police who had been tailing him arrived almost instantly, photographing his body as it lay on the cold ground. For years they had hunted for proof of his involvement in the drug trade, and now all they had was the corpse of a man who had eluded them to the very end. Luciano's funeral was a spectacle. Though barred from America in life, in death he was allowed to return. His body was shipped back to New York, where thousands came to pay respects. Gangsters, politicians, curious citizens, they all gathered to witness the passing of a legend. He was buried in St. John's Cemetery in Queens, the same ground that held many of the Mafia figures he had once commanded. The irony was complete. Luciano had spent his life building an empire that transcended nations, yet, in the end, he lay in the soil of the city that had made him, the city that had banished him, the city he could never escape. His tombstone bore his real name, Salvatore Lucania, but the world would always know him as Lucky Luciano. His legacy was both undeniable and impossible to fully define. He was the man who professionalized organized crime, who turned gangs into a corporation, who betrayed bosses only to build a system that outlived them. He was a criminal, a visionary, a patriot in wartime, a pariah in peace. He was at once the architect of the American Mafia and its eternal exile. Named. And when he died that winter's day in Naples, he left behind not just stories of murder and money, but a structure, the commission, that still guided organized crime decades later. For better or worse, the Mafia Luciano imagined had become an institution as enduring as the banks and businesses it imitated. Lucky Luciano had lived as a man of contradictions, and he died as one too, watched by police, mourned by gangsters, admired by some, despised by others. But above all, he died as what he had always been, the man who saw crime not as chaos, but as order, not as violence, but as business, a man who turned the Mafia into America's shadow corporation. Lucky Luciano's story closes not with bullets or blood, but with vision. He wasn't remembered as the most violent, nor the most ruthless. Others claimed those titles. What set him apart was foresight. Luciano saw beyond the streets, beyond the rackets and imagined crime as something larger. A system, a corporation, a machine that could run without the chaos of endless wars. That vision outlived him. The commission he founded still shaped organized crime long after his death. The structure he built became the blueprint for syndicates across the world, proving that one man's idea could ripple across decades. Luciano's paradox was that he gave order to disorder, stability to violence, and a code to those who lived outside the law. He was both an exile and an architect, a criminal who thought like a statesman. And in the end, his legacy can be summed up in one line. If Capone was the face of the mob, Luciano was its brain.